And that's a good lead in to our panel that's about to begin, because I think a lot of times when we have this diversity and inclusion conversation, we focus primarily, I would say, on race, gender, sometimes sexuality, and then there are some other areas that are often left out of the conversation, and we don't want to make that mistake today. We would be remiss if we left certain things out. So that's the role of this next panel, which is inclusion in the workplace beyond race and gender. And I am very honored to welcome our panelists to our virtual stage today. We have Kathie Trotter, Director of the Division of Vocational Rehabilitation Services at the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services. John Samuel, Chief Innovation Architect at LCI Tech. Kirby Barbour, Director of Automotive Electromechanical Solutions at Parker Lord. Susie Silver, LGBTQ+ ally consultant, speaker, and artist at Ally Consulting. And our moderator today is David Laboy, Director of Inclusion and Diversity at Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Thank you all so much for being with us. And David, since you're our moderator, I'm going to let you kick things off. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Emmy. Any day is a great day to talk about diversity and inclusion, and I'm excited to have an opportunity to, with the help of Kathie and John and Susie and Kirby, engage participants in a conversation about growing diversity beyond just race and gender, which traditionally have defined diversity initiatives for organizations, and then looking at a broader view of diversity and the things that make us whole and who we are. So recently, we've heard a lot more about the concepts of authenticity, bringing your whole self to work, and being able to develop a sense of belonging. So the first question that I want to start the panel with, and I'll look at you, Susie, to get us started. So why is it important for organizations to look at diversity with a broader lens? And what are some of the other or additional dimensions of diversity that companies should consider as they continue to evolve their diversity initiatives?
Right. Thank you so much, and thank you. It's an honor to be here today. So to broadly answer that question, and I think inherently we know the answer, but I'm going to state it because we need to think about it. It's the right thing to do. Simple answer. It is the right thing to do. A little more specifically, when you brought in the diversity initiatives and the diversity of the company, you will generate more revenue. There were bottom lines. And also, you're going to increase productivity and job satisfaction. So what you said just a moment ago of bringing your whole self, when you know you're in a place that is inclusive and supportive, all of those major components fall right into place. And so to be more specific of what other entities can be considered, I, of course, am representing the LGBTQ community, Q+, IA. I usually shorten it while I'm talking for sake of time. You know, often in the diversity and inclusion conversation, the community is left out. And it's not so much by any malice. It's just a part of D&I or DEI that is still sticky for people. They're not sure what to say. They're not sure what to do. They're not sure what people will think. This can cross beyond the LGBTQ community. So recognizing that and those feelings and pushing forward is a big thing. Along with many other minority groups, LGBTQ people are up there with disparities in, economic status, healthcare options, and employment opportunities. There are many studies, many facts to support this. And so to include now and broaden the LGBTQ community, and I know we're going to be talking about more communities as well, my other panelists, it's important to think about that, the broad sense and the specifics. And, over half of LGBTQ people in the US, we're not even talking worldwide, over half in the US live in states where they can be passed over for a promotion, not hired, fired, just because of their gender and sexual orientations and identities. That's a huge thing to think about, huge number. And we're not having enough conversations about that. So it's really important to think about it. And lastly, about workplace discrimination for LGBTQ people, over 40% of LGB people have felt discrimination in the workplace, and 90% of T, transgender people, have felt discrimination, in the workplace. Here's the thing. Almost nobody reports it because they're afraid, because they aren't sure what the support is. They aren't sure what the initiatives are. They aren't sure that they're going to be safe and secure, not just as a person, but their job, their livelihood. So I hope that gives a little bit more clarity on, yes, this is my specific lane that I'm speaking to. This can cross over. So thinking about your company, business, what are the initiatives you have taken into account? And now what are some other subsidiary things we need to think about?
Thank you, Susie. So, and you bring a great point that reminds me that because we sometimes default to visible attributes of diversity that are easy to identify, we make assumptions about who we have present in our organizations, but there are many. I mean, you may not be able to look at someone and determine their sexual orientation or gender identity, or the employee may have a non-visible disability. And there are a lot of other things that are now part of the diversity spectrum that we don't see. Educational background, communication style, which was addressed in the keynote from True earlier. And it's a challenge for organizations to develop programming that will help employees, whether they have a disability that's non-visible, or they're part of the LGBTQ plus I community. And that brings me to the next question that I have, which is around how do we track this demographic so that we can have a true grasp of the different demographic groups and representation in our workforce. So, and then also, what are some challenges that come with that, right? Because sometimes it's not easy. Depending on the cultures that we have in our organizations, employees may not feel comfortable to disclose, even if organizations have or encourage self-identification. So, Susie, since you're an advocate at large, I just wanted to come back to you to ask if you could share perhaps some best practices that you've seen with some of the organizations that you work with around how do you track that, and how do you make it safe for employees to have that trust in the organization to feel comfortable disclosing their whether it is their sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, veteran status?
Right, and that's a great question, and you are correct. It is a tough thing because you want to have this information that's important for your company, but you want your employees to feel safe. And the number one thing is to be transparent with your employees. And more specifically, the company needs to clearly define why this information would be gathered. What is the main purpose, and communicate that and be transparent. If you can't tell why, then why would you even collect it? And then what is it going to be used for? Why are we going to collect this? What is it, and how does it align with the company's mission and vision of diversity? So really being specific of the why, the how, what is it going to be driving in the diversity initiatives or company initiatives, and not just recruitment and retainment. You know, I know that's an important component that we'll talk about maybe a little bit later, but beyond that, what, why, how, and then communicate also how this information is going to be stored and secured. So if people feel safe, they will most likely want to give information. That's the broad answer. More specifically on what is on these forms or surveys, the data that's collected, as expansive of knowledge as possible. So doing the work, the research, and it's not just white, black, other, or white, black, Hispanic, other. I'm going to talk about othering in just a moment. And using as expansive language as possible. Gender. It's quite often male, female. Sometimes we see non-binary or transgender on something. Male, female, non-binary, gender fluid, gender non-conforming. Yes, it might make things a little longer to read, but that is going to communicate safety. It's going to communicate inclusion. And there's a couple specifics I just mentioned, othering. If we can use language instead of other, that is an immediate communication tool that you are a safe place and you see and you hear the people that are working for you. And so a couple solutions, some people will put prefer not to say. Well, that can inherently make somebody come out, or whether it's with a gender or sexual identity, a race, a cultural identity, you could say prefer to self-identify, prefer to self-describe, and leave it open. And you could still have prefer not to say, but those two together are really good tools and they're easy to adapt in this data collection. So what is it? Why? How is it going to be stored? What is the purpose of it in relation to the company's mission, vision, values, and goals?
Thank you. So I'm going to ask a follow-up question, because as you were talking, Susie, so there are challenges with self-identification for many demographic groups.
Many, yes.
And so I wanted to quickly turn to Kathie, since your work with vocational rehabilitation services will connect you with a lot of people who are trying to get in the workforce. We just wanted to get your perspective from you know, the people that may have different abilities or disabilities. What are perhaps some of the reservations or fears when it comes to self-disclosure for this particular talent demographic?
Yeah, thank you for asking. There are so many, right? We all go into a job situation, whether we're at the point of doing the application or interviewing, and we're nervous because we want the job. We want to put our best foot forward. So of course, a person that knows that they have some functional limitations, they aren't sure what the employer's knowledge may be, or where they stand on equality and inclusion. And so they're gonna be quite nervous about you know, how they're perceived. And what we can all do as employers is to readily make it an open and inclusive environment, even from the very beginning. Like Susie was saying, on the, you know, from the very beginning at the application, having options that are open, having a question around what type of accommodations might you need for an interview. Those kinds of questions open the door and say, it's okay. It's okay to say, you know, that I wear a hearing aid, or it's okay to say that I need, you know, to have a soft chair or a taller chair, that kind of thing. It suddenly opens the door that this is okay to talk about. So I think the most important thing that employers can do as we want to be more inclusive and swing the doors wide is to not be afraid of the conversation, to realize that we all have abilities and limitations and things that may be a struggle or whatever for us, that make us who we are, that make us stronger, give us more value, and welcome that, and welcome those differences, whatever they may be.
Great, thank you, Kathie. And this is actually a perfect segue for the next question that we want to explore as a panel. which is about best practices to help us actually swing those doors wide open. And I'm going to turn to Kirby for this next question. Just wanted to ask you to, as someone who's a huge advocate for individuals on the autism spectrum, what are some practical initiatives, or what practical advice would you have for an organization who wants to launch an initiative to hire more people with disabilities?
Well, I'll speak to my experience as a father of a child with autism. I got into the diversity and inclusion experience last year at the event in Raleigh. And, what I realized in that discussion was that there's so many demographics that are underrepresented in the workforce. And when you look at those with disabilities, in the case of autism, for my situation, my son, it's on the order of 80 to 85% unemployment. And that should, frighten us all that there's this population of individuals that want to have jobs and many times have the skills and capabilities to execute in an environment where they can shine. But what happens is when they come into an organization that doesn't recognize, or where they don't feel like they can self-advocate, they get lost. The interview process has a way of excluding them. Recruiting process has a way of excluding them. And so, there's these great skills that exist out there, but if you can't detect them, if you don't give that person the ability to interview in a safe environment where there are some accommodations, where the interview panel may know how to better engage people with disabilities or on the autism spectrum, that interview experience is going to be a lot more fulfilling on both sides. I think both sides can learn, and we can start to place people at a much higher rate than what we've traditionally done.
Right.
Anyone else want to chime in?
Actually, I'd like to.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I agree completely with everything that he stated. With vocational rehabilitation services, our entire mission is to help people with disabilities gain employment, competitive employment that's integrated, that's employment they want to be in. And so we try to make those matches between employers and the clients that we work with that have disabilities all across the state. And in doing that, we find so many times that employers don't have the knowledge, don't have the tools, and they're afraid, similar to what Kirby was saying. And so we've made an effort to provide what's called a windmills class, and that class teaches awareness about disability. And it's offered for free to employers. They need only to ask, and we provide that for them. As to start opening those doors, and lower, the anxiety and all of that, so that we can see the talent that doesn't look like, our talent, or someone we know, but be able to, embrace the diversity so that we can find those jewels that are out there that have just the talent that we're actually looking for. There's over 1 million people in North Carolina that have a disability, as reported in the last census, but their unemployment rates are always twice as high as everyone else's, if not more. So there's a lot of talent out there that we're missing out on if we remain in that space where we're afraid of diversity in the area of disability. So I think there are resources out there. We just need to use them to effectively find talent. Yeah.
Totally agree. So a lot of what I'm hearing really looks at the life cycle of an employee, right? From when you're sourcing and looking for that talent, to when you engage the talent to come in for an interview, and then if they get an offer, once then they're in, what kind of environment are you building to enable the individual success? So the next thing I want to explore and I'm going to turn to John for this one, is looking at how companies need to adapt if they want to successfully attract, retain, and develop talent with disabilities, and then also specifically, what are perhaps some accommodations they need to be willing to make to have that challenge thrive, and then what challenges they may need to be willing to address. To going back to Kathie, just open that door wide open.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, David. It's a great question. I'll kind of share my own personal kind of thoughts on this, because a few years ago when I was moving back to North Carolina and I was looking for jobs, I was introduced to a lot of, the diversity and inclusion movement, all these different companies who had these different initiatives, and I started reaching out. And I personally felt that I didn't check off a box that they were trying to check, right? I didn't check off that box. As a person who was blind and with a disability, I was finally being open about my disability. But as you look at the poll, right, only 25% of people had interactions with somebody with a disability or with autism, right? I think that's kind of that proximity. We don't have that exposure. So there's this chicken and the egg. And I think that once, you start to bring on people into your organization, you'll learn what type of accommodations, as long as you have a culture that is inclusive and is in a belonging, really trying to make sure that people of all abilities feel like they belong and can feel like they can disclose and discuss their needs. Because a lot of the accommodations that people with disabilities actually need is very, the dollar numbers, I think that's what a lot of companies think about, is the cost of it. It's actually quite low. And then there's amazing resources like Kathie and her organization and her colleagues at Services for the Blind. The state is so pro getting people on with disabilities employed, and that they're going to support private sector companies here to make sure that they have the accommodations they need. It's just reaching out to those partners and asking, what kind of accommodation, what support can you provide us? And also just talking to people, right? I think it goes back to talking to people. What kind of accommodations do you need? Making sure that from the very beginning, the application process, is it accessible, right? You're not going to get people with disabilities applying if they can't even get past that gate of the application. But making sure that you make this culture of belonging from the very offset, when you look at your website, to the makeup of your organization. And I think that once you start to talk to people and start to hear what their needs are and actually take action on that, by making sure your application is accessible for people, making sure that the interview process is accessible and accommodating, it really comes down to those simple things that can really make a big difference. And that doesn't really cost much money.
Great. Thank you, John.
I would build on John's comment just a little bit too, that, if you look at folks with autism, on autism spectrum, we benefit as a society and within companies by helping to communicate better. True made some great points during his presentation. If you haven't had experience of engaging with those on the autism spectrum, quite frankly, they want clear information, concise feedback, and little ambiguity. And if you look at what's needed from a communication standpoint, that's going to benefit everybody in the company. If we can come to that realization that we just need to be direct and concise and provide that consistent feedback and communication.
Great, thank you, Kirby. So undoubtedly, all talent brings to the culture of the organization, contributes to the success of the organization. But since we're now specifically talking about people with disabilities, I am going to direct my next question to you, Kathie, because of the work that you do. Just wanted you to expand on what are some of the benefits that companies can realize by hiring more people with disabilities or people in the autism spectrum specifically.
Thank you. Of course, the largest benefit, right, is the talent that you that you get, right?
Mm-hmm.
People with disabilities are not necessarily less qualified. They're not less able. They're not less anything, right? We're people just like everybody else, and have different strengths and talents and abilities and experiences that make us solid employees. You know, when you look at the statistics, you know, longevity is high, you know, hiring rate is high, job satisfaction is high among people with disabilities. So you're getting good, solid employees. And when you know, we all have different trials in our life and things that we go through, and you know how those can make you stronger. And so a lot of times you're getting some very unique strengths when you're working with folks that are diverse. Now there's also work incentive tax credits and things like that that you can apply for, that the government is trying to encourage the hiring of persons with disabilities. We've mentioned the assistance you can get through vocational rehab, services for the blind, like John mentioned. If you're working with those agencies, assistance maybe with accommodations and training and other things like that are also available to you. So many, many benefits, but by far the largest is going to be that great employee that you get. And I can't help but echo what John was saying about being free to ask, to just talk to people. And I think that's one thing that crosses all of what we're talking about, every group that's underrepresented in employment. None of us know everything. So you've got to be willing to be transparent and to just ask, what can I do? I want this organization to be open and diverse and, you know, and accommodating. Tell me from your perspective, what can I do to make this workplace diverse and accommodating to you? So asking that question is never offensive. You know, that's a question from the heart, and it's a question that shows that you and your organization are thinking in the right direction, and you're not expected to know everything.
Great.
I'd like to hop on that if possible as well.
Yeah, go ahead.
Because, you know, my team, I work for LCI Tech. We're a division of LCI, which is the largest employer of Americans who are blind. And, you know, so I get this opportunity, and my entire team, 70% of my team, 7 people on my team who are blind or low vision. And when I look at people who graduate from college or accomplish these things, you have to be a problem solver. And I always go back to what organization doesn't want a problem solver?
Exactly.
And, you know, and that's kind of one of those aren't trades you can just treat. You can't just train. People are natural problem solvers. We figure out solutions. You know, I figured out how to drive without seeing. That's not the smartest thing. You can figure out solutions. But I think that's kind of the mentality. You know, problem solver. We figure out solutions, and we're resilient. And I think that's something that's every company needs and wants.
Great. So our conversation, really what we're discussing and the outcomes that we're trying to get to are, how do we build more equitable processes and practices that are going to help us be more inclusive. And I want to go back to Susie, because at the beginning of the discussion, we were talking specifically about the LGBTQ plus community and some of the challenges that may be specific to that talent segment. So just wanted to ask if you could share with the group what are some of the tools and resources organizations can leverage as they're trying to build more inclusive cultures, and they're trying to be allies for LGBTQ plus employees or prospective talent, and any other efforts that they may want to launch in their organizations.
Sure. And I think a lot of what I'll say can cross communities. I had this conversation with somebody yesterday. We have to be willing to be uncomfortable. As Kathie just said, ask questions. What True said, how have we contributed potentially to a problem? And so it all comes together, and not just the LGBTQ plus community, it can cross. I'm here to speak specifically. But I wanted to start with that, because we can think about all of those things, and that's powerful to just sit with. More specifically, so employee resource groups, we're going to talk about that next in the conference, how important those employee resource groups are for all of the communities, and adding a component to support LGBTQ plus. And again, asking questions of how you can do that and what policies you can have in place, what support systems, but people need those. And especially, as I mentioned, some people don't feel safe or comfortable in their workplace or with their team or with their manager. And so those employee resource groups may be the main safe place for someone of the community. And that's one huge thing. Pride initiatives, go for it. Pride initiatives, education is key. And we heard that today. We've got to learn, we've got to talk, we've got to ask those questions. Don't be afraid to reach out for education. And then in the Pride initiatives, it can be a simple step. Things like showing your logo in the rainbow, you know, or having an opportunity for somebody to display in their work, well, when we're in workspaces or virtually, some Pride or ally gear. I spoke to somebody recently, and I think I saw in the chat your email signature, including pronouns, understanding what those mean. So there's these broad things, and then there's some specifics. I also think that C-level leadership, needs to be more representative, not just of the LGBTQ plus, but vast. And that's a conversation that doesn't always have the most welcome outcome to and answers, but really looking at the top level leadership, and under that, leadership statements, culture. So yes, diversity inclusion statements, get specific. Talk about different communities and be specific, because somebody's out there waiting to read it, waiting to hear it. And that could be a potential talent, a recruit, or a current employee. And you know, there are so many things I could go on for hours of the specifics you could do, but I wanted to give some broad sense to the concept of being an ally, being an active ally. And I really truly believe in sitting in that uncomfortable, having constructive and conscious conversations, going back to some of what True said, and learning from each other and lifting each other up. I do feel like, because of the time we're in, and not just immediate time, but the general sense of time, that it's an unsaid thing at a lot of companies where it's like, well, of course we're supportive. Of course we love you or support you. We are at it. We have got to say it. We have to practice it. And so that is shifting the mindset and really pushing forward to be more inclusive all around, but to the community. And as I said, my community is feeling, on the outside may show one thing, and on the inside it's feeling very unsettled. And so that's just something to think about. And I hope I've provided some broad sense and some specifics, but things you can do. Feel free also to reach out to me. I can definitely help you with more specifics.
You know, something you said, Susie, reminded me of the phrase "inclusion is a verb." Right? We need to practice that on our everyday. So we have about 6 minutes left, and I want to make sure that we leave some room for questions from the audience. But before we turn to our audience, I just wanted to quickly recap some of the things that we talked about. So organizations should have a broader view of diversity to include some dimensions of diversity that fall outside of the standard, normally Title VII things like race, gender, ethnicity, national origin and disability, and look at sexual orientation, gender identity, visible and non-visible disabilities, educational status, and some of the other things that make us unique and make us whole. And also, as organizations look at expanding their view of diversity, looking at the type of workplaces and cultures we're building, right? To invite those talent segments that may be underrepresented. So looking at our processes, so from how our job descriptions are written, how accessible our application processes are, what accommodations do we need to be willing to make for different talent segments that may require such accommodations. And then also looking at how do we leverage and build community within to make sure that employees feel connected, feel that they are part of a community, and by doing that, then we will help employees feel a sense of belonging that John mentioned earlier, and just building overall richer and more vibrant cultures that are going to help or enable the success of the organization. So I hope this recap was good for all of you taking notes. And now the last 4 minutes that we have for our panel, just want to open it up for questions from our audience.
No,
Thank you, David.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. I'm going to go ahead and pose the questions that are posted in the Q&A. Okay,
All right.
And hopefully we'll have time to answer them. Okay, first one is, I believe it was Kathie mentioned the windmills training class. A participant wanted to know if that is free and how would an employer look into this training?
Oh, great question. Yes, the windmills is offered for free to employers, and you would simply need to reach out to your local vocational rehabilitation services office. And we have offices all across the state. We serve all 100 counties. But if you're not sure how to contact them, feel free to reach out to me. Let me know where you are and I'll get you in touch with the right person. Thanks for asking.
Thank you for that. Next question actually is for you as well, Kathie.
Okay.
Does the NC Vocational Rehab assist and support employers with placing individuals with disabilities? I know in other states there are programs that specifically connect employers to candidates with disabilities.
We absolutely do that. Yes, we work with individuals that are seeking employment that have disclosed that they have a disability, and we've worked with them on what their goals are and how to reach those goals. And so we work directly with them and helping them find employers. And then we also reach out to employer groups and try to engage with them around what their needs are and maybe how some of the folks that we're working with may meet those needs. So we actually work in both directions. Yep. So just reach out to us.
Thank you. Next question. Individuals with intellectual disabilities need job coaches and shadowing. How can we get more companies to be willing to invest in these individuals, and where will the funding come from? There is an innovation waiver that helps fund some of this, but there are over 13,000 people in North Carolina that are on a waiting list. In the meantime, what are the job options for these individuals?
Yes, I'm very aware of what they're talking about with the innovations waiver. For those of you that aren't, there are many programs through vocational rehabilitation that we have programs and services to assist people, because we work with persons with all different types of disabilities, mental health, substance use, just every range you can think of physical, sensory, intellectual disabilities. One service that we do have involves supported employment. And with that service, that's for folks that need a little more hands-on job coaching and support in a work environment. And oftentimes it is with folks that have some intellectual disabilities. And with that service, we're able to assist them with a job coach that's there with them to help train them and help them in the work environment. Well, the job coaching that we're able to offer is only for a limited amount of time. And once that time period expires, our job coach has to kind of back away. And the hope is that the person will get to a point where they're able to perform the job independently. However, there are some folks that will need long-term job coaching. And that's where that innovations waiver they mentioned comes into play. And that's actually a separate program that we kind of partner with to provide this kind of support. And that Innovations Waiver Program can support job coaching long-term. Unfortunately, because it is a long-term service, and there are so many people that are requesting that type service, they do have a waiting list of some kind. And like I said, that is not a direct program that we house, but we do work with them, so I'm very familiar with that. I can say that when you talk about other options for that same group, there are a variety of things that we've been able to do and work with. Sometimes it's having a good job match, where the job really matches that person's talents and their abilities. Sometimes it's the type of training that you do, the type of supported employment that you have in place, and other supports that you can have for the person, whether it's community, family, as well as those supports that we provide, and orchestrating all of that. So I would encourage anyone that is facing that type of dilemma to approach vocational rehab, and let's try to work on that, and maybe present what you've already tried, and that, you know, the goal is employment, and just take some time working through that to see if there are other programs and services that can help get you to your goal.
Kathie, let me ask you this. Do you have train the trainer programs? So perhaps when you have a coach come and work with an organization, an increasing number of organizations have built internal coaching practices. So perhaps have a couple of coaches internally maybe shadow your coach from your program, and then once your coach has to exit, there are maybe a dozen employees that can continue to work with that particular individual. I don't know if you would consider that type of engagement.
Yeah. Oh, we would welcome that. And that's why I think it's so important to build that relationship with the employer, so that we're aware of what resources they have, and we can put it all together, our resources, theirs, and others that we may know about in the community. Because as John mentioned, there's just a lot out there, but you have to, key into it. So working together is key. But I mean, there are some great employees. Just because they need a certain kind of support doesn't mean that this isn't a great employee, and going to give you exactly what you need and what your company needs. So yeah, it's definitely worth that, and we definitely would be willing to do that, of course.
David, I'll hop onto that real quick. That's actually something we're working on right now, because we see the value of that's the way it's going to be sustainable, right? It's getting organizations to think about this from the design of the programs, and so that that comes from training the trainers. So when you're designing new programs, you're thinking about accessibility and accommodation at the foundation, because it makes it much easier. And working with Voc Rehab and DSB, that's some of the things that we're looking, and even the Capital Area Workforce Development Board. So there's some really great players out there, and I think one of the things we have to do right now is help connect the dots. And we connect everyone together to do this.
Can I insert another thing really quick? I know we're on our questions, but another opportunity that you may want to take advantage of as you're trying to expand is internships. Being willing to open your door for someone with a disability or another underrepresented group, and to have an internship experience. Sometimes those type of experiences are just what you need to start learning and broadening your scope on what it means to work with someone of a different group. And it may be just what that person needs in order to see, is this the type of work I want to do? Is this, the environment for me? And to build their resume and have those opportunities. So we offer internship programs that will support the student or the adult, while they're at the workplace learning the job. So there's no cost to the employer, and we cover their workers' comp as well while they're having that experience, because we know how valuable that type of experience is. So as you're developing those type of volunteer or internship programs, don't forget about persons with disabilities and reaching out to these resources to help refer someone.
All right, so I want to make sure that we are on track. So I want to thank the panel. So Kathie, John, Susie, Kirby, thank you so much for making this such a rich discussion that's going to, I'm sure, will help all of us as we go back and figure out ways that we can be more inclusive in our hiring practices, but then also in accommodating the needs of different talent segments. So thank you, and thank you to the Chamber for inviting us to be part of this conversation this morning.
Thank you.